Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternet. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
It's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes says,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
First of all, I want to thank all of the kind folks who donated to our fundraiser here on We Are Respectable Negroes and ChaunceyDeVega.com. We do a fundraiser twice a year, and I'm always impressed and so touched by the generosity of the friends and fans of the website. Folks dug into their pockets. They shared the love. I know folks got a lot of responsibilities in the holiday season. Friends, family, I know the economy is not what it should be. But again, I want to thank everybody for helping us to reach that goal. So that's the first bit of business I want to attend to. Because, you know, every podcast, I have the handout. We do our twice-a-year fundraiser. And I always feel a little bit dirty. Be like, man, I got to have the begging bowl out. And needless to say, folks always click on that PayPal link. And they write some really kind notes. And they send some really, really good and positive energy. And yeah, the material support certainly helps. We have expenses, opportunity costs, and so on. But it's really the notes and the messages and the fact that someone would take the time to sit down, open their wallets, and say, here's what I got. And the range of donations went from, you know, modest amounts to rather large amounts. And to see that folk value what we're doing here in that way means so much. And for the folks who, you know, gave the small amount, that's telling me that's a positive gesture of wonderful energy, because sometimes it takes a lot of energy and a lot of time, and folks are on these really tight budgets to throw $5 in or a few bucks in. And you have other folks who are saying, hey, you know what, I'm in a position where I can dig deeper and give you $100, $200, $300, or in some cases, you know, $400 or $500 for some of our biggest boosters here on the site. And that's another sort of gesture saying, hey, I got this, and I want to contribute, and I want to give back. And as you can hear in my voice, that means a lot to me. So I want to thank everybody for that. I don't want to talk too much in my intro here. Got a great guest, the one and only Tim Wise. You know who he is. You've seen him on TV, read his books, been on CNN, Headline News, MSNBC, travels around the country, arguably one of the country's leading anti-racist educators, lecturers, and activists. Cool folks. He's been a real friend of my work online and elsewhere. And we've bantered back and forth over the years. And I was like, Tim, when I get a podcast, you got to come on. And of course he said yes. So this is my kind thank you of sorts to the friends and fans of the website. This is our holiday podcast edition. It's going to be Christmas this week to give us a little time stamp, a little time mark for where we are. And Tim and I just had a great conversation, as you're going to see. And he and I talked about some things that you're probably not going to hear him share when he's on the news or the typical sort of interviews that he does, because everybody approaches him for wisdom and knowledge and sharing. And there's so many things about the day-to-day and about life and about travel and about the media and about work that the brother never gets asked. So it was really a conversation between two fellow travelers, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I was joking just now on Twitter that thinking about what just went down in New York, of course, you had two police who were killed in an ambush in Brooklyn. And I've done some truth-telling about the killings of Eric Garner, about Michael Brown. And I wrote a series of essays about 3 or 4 days ago that I think are two of the best things I've ever written. And they're sort of in a holding pattern because that is business. And I'm waiting to get the go-ahead to see if they're going to be launched, if the powers that be are going to turn the key and send the missiles off. And I don't think that you should ever surrender truth-telling to timing. I have more questions than answers, thinking about what happened in New York with the killing of those two police officers. But I'm really fascinated by the public rituals of mourning and how somehow is a reflection of a twisted, demented, wicked, lacking in ethics, hostile, bigoted, sort of right-wing logic and political imagination. Not as pithy with my witty as I like to be there, a little tongue-tied, but it's just real talk here for a moment. How anyone can link the protests, the pleas, the demands that the police stop engaging in thuggery and police brutality and violence against black and brown folks in this country with the killing of these two cops. I don't understand how anyone, critical thinker, an intellectual person who's honest, I guess there's my answer there, these people are not honest, to somehow say that our demands as American citizens that you don't beat us, kill us, shoot us dead, strangle us in the street, somehow is the equivalent of an assault on the cops and an encouragement to violence against the police. As I've said online and many other venues and talking to friends and family, I'm like, all lives matter. Everybody's life matters. And just because you put on a uniform and you choose to be a police officer, whole conversation there that I get into on these 2 new essays I wrote, you made a choice, you get a salary, you get a retirement, you're protected. Yet folks want to feign police victimhood. Again, part of that longer series of essays. This twisted belief that somehow would demand that the cops do their jobs. And I would think all the cops would want to do their jobs. I would think all the cops want to treat people with respect because it makes their job easier. That somehow would demand that the cops do their jobs and treat people with respect can be responded to. And I can't believe I'm reading some of this stuff. New York Times, police thug spokesman, Mr. Lynch. I'll just call him Mr. Lynch. I won't call him Willie Lynch. I'll call him Mr. Lynch. Basically threatening the black and brown folk in New York and saying that there's blood on the hands of the good protesters who are demanding the civil rights of people of color. Then you have the Police Benevolence Association, I believe it was them, basically saying it's going to be a wartime approach to policing in New York. Well, they're declaring war, as they always have on black and brown communities. So I was joking on Twitter, as I said earlier, that when I'm talking from the heart about these things, I'm trying to understand madness. I'm trying to understand why the police, who are supposed to be, we know the lead, right? We know the qualifier. They're all good cops. Cops have a hard job. The vast majority of police are good, hardworking people. Well, when the cops kill innocent people, where are those police at? Are they standing shoulder to shoulder with the victims of police thuggery and brutality? Are they maintaining the thin blue line of silence? And what we're seeing here, and as I said, it's so frustrating, is you have folks like Al Sharpton trying to take the high road. You have the families of Eric Garner and others standing in alliance with the families of these 2 police who were killed. And I want to say, damn, when are the cops going to go and stand side by side and shoulder to shoulder at the funerals of black and brown people that their brothers and sisters have shot dead in the street who were innocent and unarmed? It's unfathomable to me. And there have been a lot of really smart folks asking really smart questions online and in print. If you haven't read Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's essay in Time, brilliant stuff. And he sums it up as this effort to derail, talks about the freedoms, the civil liberties, and justice for black and brown folk and others who were shot dead and killed by thug cops, who then are allowed to walk free, or in the case of Darren Wilson, are made into millionaires without consequence for their actions. That part of this is politics. It's an opportunity for the police, who are Republicans, and their spokesmen to attack Democratic elected officials in New York, the mayor in particular, de Blasio. And he's so smart. I mean, Kareem is really a Renaissance man. If you have doctors who are committing malpractice, and I'm protesting malpractice by doctors, doesn't mean I hate all doctors. It means I want better doctors. Or if we had truck drivers driving around running people over, bus drivers, and we're protesting about it because we want them to be accountable, doesn't mean that we're quote unquote bigoted against truck drivers. The logic here that the cultural mythology that gives the police a shield for all accountability and all responsibility it really is a step in a site of creeping authoritarianism and fascism. The idea, and think about the premise here, in the public discourse after police are killed in the line of duty, that somehow their lives are more valuable than everybody else's, that because they have a uniform, that somehow we are supposed to mourn their loss more so than we would mourn the loss of anyone else. Or that we have a protected class of people who have been given power by the state to kill, who are acting in many cases irresponsibly, killing unarmed black folk every 28 hours in this country. Police have killed so many people, and some folks doing some good reporting on this, that we don't even have data on it. There's no national database because it's self-reported data, and the cops check you off as a quote-unquote justified shooting, and that's the end of it. This is a human rights issue. So at the risk of cutting a Dusty Rhodes or Randy Macho Man Savage promo, or perhaps the Ultimate Warrior, as I get going on this, I'm going to self-censor. I'm simply going to transition into the great conversation with Brother Tim Wise. And I know there's some folks out there, if you look through the archive, I don't want to speak their name lest they appear. There are some racial chauvinists. I'll be a little more gracious. Racial chauvinists, hooga-mooga, troglodytes, who have a paraphilia and a fetish for Tim Wise. And I recently did an interview with one of them, and he was fixated on Mr. Tim Wise. So perhaps this will be scintillating and titillating material for that person. I was going to call the brother a moon cricket, but I don't want to give him that sort of shot. I don't need to go to the moon cricket, one of my favorite insults to hurl at somebody. But that having been said, I couldn't resist. Tim Wise, episode 6, season 3 of the Chauncey DeVega show. Great conversation, and I do think you'll enjoy it. Tim Wise, on behalf of the eponymously named podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show, I want to thank you for taking time out of your really busy schedule. Quite literally, you were just on CNN. We're sitting down and chatting. So, number one, how are you? How was the flight and how was the segment?
The flight was fine. I mean, it's, as uneventful, which is all I ask for airplane flights nowadays. And the CNN segment was actually great. I do enough of these to where I'm sort of cynical about them. And I have a feeling that most of the time it doesn't have a lot of impact because it's 5 minutes, 6 minutes. But they actually did a full hour segment, and they're doing it all week on HLN, which is, the headline news. It's normally like, it's Nancy Grace and it's Dr. Drew. And it's like a lot of times, in my estimation, particularly politically substantive. But all week long, they're doing an hour every night to talk about issues of race and police accountability. And so, I was really pleased with the program. We had a lot of good guests on talking about some really serious issues, and we had a whole hour to do it. So it wasn't like one of those one and done 5 minute, 6 minute segments. It was actually pretty strong.
And who were the other people on the segment? For folks who didn't get a chance to see it,
some of the other folks. Goldie Taylor was on. There was a civil rights attorney whose name I now do not recall. There was a former member of the NYPD, actually, very interesting sort of former police chief who I don't remember his name, and I don't remember how long it's been since he was in the NYPD, but he was an interesting guy. He actually sort of acknowledged that there were some real issues with policing in black communities. He didn't go as far as I would have liked for him to go, but as a former cop, he was pretty good. Francesca Ramsey, who's an actress and a blogger, and did the really great blog the other day, 5 Tips for Being an Ally, which was actually a really strong viral video that she put out. She was on the show. I had the pleasure of being on Huffington Post Live with her again, also just a day or so ago. So it was a bunch of good folks. And the hosts were Sonny Hostin and Joey Jackson, who, are on pretty regularly, and they did a great job. For mainstream, quote unquote, corporate news, it was actually a pretty productive conversation.
So, I've talked over the years via email, and we keep promising next time you're in Chicago or I'm down where you are, we'll get a beer. I admire your ability to go on TV and actually go beyond talking points. Because, it's really hard, as you're an expert on this, to say, okay, you got 5 minutes, but I can only maybe say one or two things with any depth. So how have you learned how to manage that? And what do you think separates you from folks who are still struggling? Because there are a lot of folk who try to go on TV and put in work, and you're just shaking your head saying you need a little bit more time. You got to work on your craft and your routine, but you seem really natural. How did that happen for you?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it's practice and opportunity to do it. Because if you go back and you look at some of my earlier media stuff from 20 years ago, it wasn't so slick, So part of it's just time and experience, but it's also I have a weird, uncanny ability to not have to breathe in between words and sentences and paragraphs and entire pages of text. So I can pretty much keep talking, and I know when the host of a show is about to interrupt me, but that's just something you learn from time and just being obnoxious, which I guess, I'm willing to be, because they tell you, the producers of these shows will tell you, don't be shy, speak up, butt in. And I try not to talk over people, but when you're doing some of these shows, it's hard because you have 6 people on a show and you have a very limited amount of time. So I just think most of the time people need to figure out 2 or 3 points that they really want to make, try to come back to those, but do it in a way that doesn't seem, like you said, talking pointy. You don't want to make it seem as though you're just doing rote memorized stuff. You want to sort of go with the flow, but at the same time, you want to try to bring it back to the things that are important.
And I'm sure it's like a dance, right? And some folk you're going to have chemistry with, others you're not. Do you have any folks, without naming them, that you're going to be on a panel with, or you're going to do the TV segment, and you're already rolling your eyes saying we've got some heat between each other, or, oh, wow, we may agree or disagree, but we have really good chemistry? I mean, does it work that way like it does in other areas of life?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, and there are certain hosts that I obviously have a good rapport with, too. I mean, I've always gotten along really well with Don Lemon. I know he catches a lot of heat, and some of that is very justified because he's said some sort of whack stuff in the last, a year and a half or so. But I still like Don personally, and he and I have a very good connection when I'm on his show. He sort of understands where I'm coming from, and I actually do understand where he's coming from, even when I disagree with him. So we tend to gel pretty well. There are a few guests that when I'm on against them, there was, I guess last year I was on against this, she goes by the name conservative black chick.
Yeah, one of my favorites.
Yeah, right. And her, I mean, she just, and it was impossible to have a conversation because maybe if we'd been in the studio together, it wouldn't be so bad. But part of it is when you're on a feed, right? It's like, I'm not not seeing her, she's not seeing me, and so we're both sort of going at each other. And maybe if we were right next to each other, it wouldn't have been so bad. But it was just sort of obnoxious because I'm trying to make a point, and she's talking over me, and she's calling me by a name that isn't my name, and I'm trying to correct her about who I am and what my name is and what my argument is. And so when it's someone like that who's a professional right-winger, like if you're an amateur, we can probably get along.
But conservative black chick, I mean, she's a professional black conservative.
Right.
I'm like, if you want to be rich in America and you're black or brown, become a conservative.
Oh, totally.
There's the money out there. There's the infrastructure. You get your hustle on. You say obnoxious things. And I go back and forth on this, and I'm curious about what your instincts are on it. I don't know if somebody like conservative black chick actually believes what she says. But she's so consistent and repetitive and banal. Maybe she's convinced herself that what she says is true.
Well, and if you go back and look at some of her, from my understanding, a few years back, she was actually sort of like, I don't think she was ever like way pro-Obama, right? But she was sending out some tweets and saying some stuff that seemed to suggest that she was not the person then that she is today. And then I wonder, okay, well, what happened in the course of 4 or 5 years to turn you into who you are? And I have to assume there was money involved, because the reality is, if and this is true, like if you're a progressive person of color, join the club. There's a lot of progressive people of color, and unfortunately they don't get heard very often. But if you're a right winger, if you're Larry Elder, you don't have to make any sense. You just can open your mouth, and white folks will, it's like the other day I made this joke on Twitter, and some folks sort of got on me about it. But I mean, like if you're Charles Barkley and say what Charles Barkley said about the jury decisions and the protest, white conservatives will line up around the block to shine your head for you. Right?
That's
right. I mean, that's what they will do. They will line up to rub your head, and they will line up to vote for Ben Carson. Because why? Because that proves they're not racist. Oh, I like black people. I love Alan West. Okay, Alan West doesn't even know any black people, right? Clarence Thomas doesn't hang out with folks of color, but therefore white folks love him. So I think it's very interesting. I think there's a longstanding, and you and I both know this, a longstanding tradition of organic black conservatism that is not like that. Right. There is a long history of respectable black conservatism that is not premised on denigrating the black community, that is not premised on, I mean, to be honest, these folks make Booker T. Washington, look like Malcolm X by comparison. Right. Because, I mean, at least Booker T. Washington, you would never believe that Booker T. Washington actually despised his community. And yet I believe that when I listen to a Larry Elder or when I listen to a Clarence Thomas, I think they have true contempt for the community from which they come. And that's a very different phenomenon.
It's like the hypocrisy of Clarence Thomas that a lot of folk have pointed out. Here's a man who benefited from affirmative action. Here's a man who's benefited from the freedom struggles of, black folk, white folk who died, honoring their memory, who literally put their lives on the line so he could be where he is. And he has such gross and ugly, never mind the fact that he should probably be disbarred. If they ever investigated this man's ethics issues with his wife and the money he's getting on the side, they kick him off the court. But as you said, you got so many folk out there with internalized racism who do quite literally hate themselves. And I don't know if, conservative black chick falls into that. And she has this keen instinct for how to say the most contrary, offensive things to get over. And if you want to get paid as a black or brown conservative or as a woman who hates feminism and hates women, or as a gay person who hates gays and lesbians, that's the way to play the game.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Ann Coulter wouldn't be anywhere near where she is as a woman talking about political stuff if she weren't the most ridiculous, caricaturish, offensive person out there. If she was just a reasonable conservative who just happened to, make conservative argument, nobody would know who she is. It's because she does books where she puts on miniskirts to appeal to, I mean, I've been in bookstores where guys are literally buying the book and saying, like, she's hot. That's their thing. Like, she's hot. That's why they want to buy her book. And this is brilliant marketing on her part. But it's because she says things like, well, if the 9/11 hijackers had just flown their planes into the New York Times building, that would have been okay. Like that. It's the kind of stuff that, allows her, in spite of all lack of intellectual credibility, to get over. And I guess that's a good hustle, if you're a marginalized group member. But the problem is Ann Coulter wouldn't acknowledge that she's affected by sexism. And Clarence Thomas won't acknowledge that he's affected by racism. I'd have a lot of respect for these folks if they're like, I've just internalized my own oppression. I mean, at least they'd be honest about it. But that's the difference, is that you've got someone like Clarence Thomas who is where he is, not only by his own admission back when he was at Yale because of affirmative action, which is nothing to be ashamed of at all. But when you then turn around and spend your career attacking the very thing that put you where you are, and it's not even just racial affirmative action. He's where he is because he's a right winger, right?
That's right.
He took Thurgood Marshall Marshall's place, for God's sake, on the Supreme Court. Do you think that if he had been an African-American jurist in the tradition of Thurgood Marshall, he'd be on the court? Absolutely not, because of who was present when that seat opened up. So he's a beneficiary not just of racial affirmative action, which at least has a justice component to it. He's the beneficiary of ideological affirmative action, which has no basis in justice whatsoever.
Unless you believe college Republicans who say they're oppressed and should get preferential admissions into colleges and universities, then he'd fit right in. He'd be a twofer. He's black and he's conservative. But how often are you traveling now? Because, I mean, you're everywhere.
Well, it depends on the year. I mean, basically, I do about, about 85 days a year on the road, which is about 65 events over the course of the year. So, you know, it's maybe 1/4 of the year I'm traveling. But I mean, I have summers off and I have a lot of time with my family too, that I just write and do other kinds of work. So it's not as bad as it has been in the past. There was a period maybe 6 or 7 years ago where I was traveling about 100 days a year, and that just about killed me and just about made my family kill me. So I had to back off.
How do you handle the time management when you're writing and flying? Are you working on the plane? Are you getting your thoughts together? I mean, you're really good. I've seen you many times. As I said, every talk seems original, seems fresh. Does it depend on the topic you're asked to speak about? Is everything extemporaneous and you're cutting and pasting from different things? Or is every conversation and talk a new one?
It's a lot of cutting and pasting. I mean, I generally roll out of my house when I go on the road with about 15 pages worth of outlines and random notes. And I know that I'm going to get to the hotel or I'm going to be on the plane. I'm going to stitch them together. You know, there are certain themes that I always come back to pretty much in all my talks. And if you listen to, 20 of my talks, you would hear some of those over and over again, and some of the same examples or anecdotes or statistics. But I try to make sure that it's not always the same. Because I remember, I speak at a lot of colleges, and I remember when I was a college student and people would come and give talks for which they were paid insane amounts of money. Now, I'm sure there are people who would say that I get paid insane amounts of money, but it's nothing compared to, we're talking like, 1988 and Henry Kissinger getting $45,000 for a speech at Tulane. It was 20 minutes long, and it's the same talk literally that he gave everywhere for about 5 years. And I've always felt like if I'm going to go and take, by the way, I get nowhere near $40,000 a speech, but if I'm going to go and get even, if I'm going to go at all and you're going to pay me at all to run my mouth, I feel like I got to give you something different than what I gave those people last week, because otherwise I'm not really doing work. I'm just getting up and I'm just repeating something like I'm an actor who memorized a script and I get to do the same play for 5 years. I just don't get the point of that. And so, for me, I try to make sure it's always different. I try to make sure that even if it's a generic speech about race, I try to connect it to what's going on in the local community, finding out what's been happening in the place where I'm traveling. Have there been racial incidents? Has there been a police brutality incident? Are there issues in the schools that are going on? I can do a little bit of research and find that stuff out, so that I try to tailor the talks, just because I feel like that's the respect that I owe the community before I show up and just start, talking about stuff.
And you have the activist background, and you've been a teacher, colleges, universities, you're organizer, you're author, writer. We'll talk about the documentary too, which is also great. I appreciate you sharing it with me. So when you go out to the universities in particular, do you prefer sort of the show up, get off the plane, get the car service, they take you there, give you a snack, and you talk for 2 hours and go home? Or do you like to actually stay there for the day and get to know the students and do the whole routine? Which do you prefer?
I prefer the latter. A lot of times we actually do try to make that happen, where I'll go in, I'll give a talk, but I might go in before the talk, meet with students, particularly student leaders and activists of color, as well as some white allies, and really try to find out from them before my speech. A lot of times I'll ask them straight up, hey, in 2 hours, I'm going to have the microphone and I'm going to be standing in front of 1,000 of your peers. And I'm going to have an hour to tell them whatever I want. So I know what I want to tell them, but what do you guys need me to tell them, right? So in other words, I'm trying to not only say what I want to say, but I want to find out particularly from the students of color on a campus, what do you, like, if you had the mic, what would you tell your white peers, right? What would you tell your classmates? Because I have the mic, I have the luxury and the privilege of that, but I want to make sure that I use it in an accountable fashion. So if I can find out what those students of color need their peers to hear, then I can work that into my talk. Now, I don't get to do that every time that I go somewhere, but I do try to do it as often as possible. We try to build that in, and when we can't do it, I still try to talk to folks electronically or via email or whatever before, to try to at least get a sense of who I'm talking to. There are times I go in and I might just give the talk and go back to the hotel and that's it. But I far prefer to go in, do multiple things if we can, and have a longer conversation.
Have you had moments where you're up there, you show up, the students have invited you precisely because of your work and who you are as a person, where you look around that audience and you can see the eyes saying, oh, damn, there's this white guy who's going to talk about white privilege, and you've already lost him? And do you have those other students where they start off and you can see the look of the resentment, and then they start to open up? Have you had those pleasant moments?
Sure. I mean, I try to always make a point of having the house lights up if I'm speaking in an auditorium. A lot of times the lighting folks will want to do something real dramatic and have a spotlight, and I hate that because I want to be able to see the audience. I want to be able to see how they're responding to what I'm saying, whether it's good or bad, just simply because as a teacher, as an educator, which is really what I consider myself, much more even so than an activist nowadays, if I'm going to be an effective educator, I need to see your eyes. I need to see what's working and what's not, so that if what I'm saying isn't working, I can adjust midstream and try a different approach pedagogically to reach you. And I have had those moments where, there are folks who are definitely doing the eye rolling thing, or they're, on their phones or whatever. But for the most part, because I'm a relatively, one of the few skills I have in the world is speaking. I can usually hold an audience, even if it's people that don't particularly like what I'm saying. I can make it entertaining for them. I can make it funny enough to where they'll stick with it. I can make it engaging enough to where they might totally hate me when it's done, but they'll go away and at least say, well, that was interesting. They're not necessarily going to throw things at me. So, and I've had people who definitely came in who I was told ahead of time, hey, you got to watch out for that guy over there. He's a real jerk. He's going to ask you a really hard question. He was running his mouth about you all day to day in class. He was going to come and really bust you, blah, blah, blah. And then it turns out that person either doesn't step to me at all, or they ask a really very softball question. Or I've even had people come up and say, hey, you know what? I totally had a wrong impression of you. I remember after 9/11 going up to Westchester County outside of the city in New York. And, I'd written a couple things post 9/11 that were highly critical of the quote unquote war on terror. And Westchester County, a lot of cops, a lot of firefighters, a lot of communities that were affected, obviously, directly by, people dying, going to save folks on 9/11. And there was this one guy who apparently for a week and a half had been trying to organize a boycott of my talk because I was essentially besmirching the memory of these firefighters and these cops, and I was anti-American and all this. So he comes to the event, to his credit. He sits in the front row. Everybody warns me about him. He'd been mouthing off for 2 weeks about how horrible I was. And by the time it was done, we ended up, he asked a question very respectfully, though, and I answered him very respectfully. And we ended up having a great conversation because I think he had one impression of me, maybe from the written word, and he got a different impression from the spoken word. And I think that happens a lot because all of us can be a lot more caustic, and I think we tend to be, in written form, because we're not looking at somebody in the face, right? And if somebody gets to know me, they might hate my writing and actually find me to be not nearly as big an asshole in person as they find me to be.
And that's the interesting thing too about the written word, thinking about how folks think they know you because of what you've written. I can only imagine what a Pulitzer Prize winning author goes through, right, with their fans, or a Stephen King type. So they read what you write. Sometimes they process it, sometimes they don't. They get this impression about who you are as a human being based on your writing. And then when they finally meet you, they're shocked and surprised that you're a real human being. And there's a lot more complexity and depth beyond, the two-dimensional space of a page. But do you even read your own comments anymore? Like when folks actually post in response, or you just ignore it?
I have had a policy for a very long time of trying not to. And what has happened, and here's why. I mean, first of all, if you're a public figure of any kind, and you're enough of one too, I'm sure that if you read your comments, you need to stop, because I'm sure people are giving you all kinds of hell for the things that you write and say, which are all so incredibly important and brilliant, by the way. But the thing about comments, I have learned that if I make the mistake of reading them, that's when I'm a human being who, just like anyone else, I don't mind constructive criticism. I mean, hell, constructive criticism makes you a better writer. It makes you a better educator. It makes you a better activist. It makes you a better person. But when the criticism is basically "you suck, go die," or when the criticism is "we don't need white allies, go to hell," then that's just ad hominem stuff. And so then if I find myself reading that, then I get amped up, and if I've had a bad day, I might fire off an angry tweet that I don't even really in that moment mean. You know what I mean? I mean, and so I found myself a couple, I don't know, a year and a half ago, I remember, maybe it was 2 years, a year and a half, I had not cut off my notifications on my Mac, right? So normally I wouldn't see if somebody tweeted something with my hashtag or with my, at Tim Jacob Wise, I wouldn't necessarily see it because unless I'm looking for it, I wouldn't notice it. But my Mac would send me a notification, right, if someone tweeted with that. And so I was getting ready to shut down my computer this particular day. I was done. I was getting ready to take a break. And all of a sudden I see this notification pop up that someone had just said something really snarky. And instead of just going ahead and shutting down the computer, I was like, wait, what the hell? What the hell was that? And then, and then I clicked on it, and then I went, ballistic on somebody, which was just, it was amateurish of me. It was immature. It was just, I was being a jerk, and I shouldn't have done it. But I think that's the thing, when you feed the trolls, they keep coming back, and people are going to be angry at you. Sometimes it's for legitimate reasons. And after I went off on the people I went off on, I deserved to be criticized. I mean, that was the irony of it. The original criticism was ridiculous, but then I made an ass of myself, and I invited the other criticism. So, I just think it's better when you're any kind of a public figure. Don't read your press. Don't read your comments. If somebody really has constructive criticism, they will send that to you in an email. They will take the time to get in touch with you with a longer comment than a 140-character tweet. I
mean, and those long emails, I'm sure, over your career, you've had probably thousands of emails.
Well, absolutely. And, I've even had, I remember a couple years back, I decided to try this approach because someone recommended it to me. And I said, what the hell? I got nothing better to do. It was a Sunday afternoon or something. And someone who had written me several hostile emails before, most of which I had ignored, one or two of which I had probably responded to pretty snarkily, who is an overt white nationalist. I mean, this guy is openly he would not say white supremacist, but, I would. And he certainly would claim white nationalism. And so I decided instead of blasting him back or ignoring him, that I was going to try to respond with a thoughtful, discussion-oriented comment just to see how it would go. I was just curious. And my theory at the time was, if he ignores it or he blasts back at me, then I'm done. I'm never going to try again. Well, he ended up writing me back very thoughtfully, and we went several rounds back and forth. And to be honest, 2 years later, it's been almost 2 years, we have this weird, I have a Nazi pen pal. It's the weirdest thing because this guy I totally have no common ground with politically, but I've found myself able to connect with him as a father, as a human being, as a man, talking about a lot of things. And we don't agree on anything except the importance of eating healthy. That's the only thing. But he sends me advice about how to do yoga. And he sends me oh, you should get a recumbent bike because they're really good for your back. I mean, it's bizarre, right? But here's the important thing about that. He's not changing my views, obviously. I'm not changing his. But what I do think is valuable about that interaction is it demonstrates that at the core, most people, including people who have views that are just absolutely repugnant, are still decent human beings. I think he happens to be a horribly conflicted individual politically and ideologically, but he's a decent human being. And if I can respond to him, if I can reach out to him with humanity and decency, and he can do the same to me, then I have to believe that the whole notion of restorative justice, the whole idea that we can build a more just society, even when we have people against whom we are politically very much arrayed and we're never going to see eye to eye with, I have to think that bodes well for humanity if we're able to do that. And it's been really rewarding because now when I see his email come up, I don't get that my blood pressure doesn't shoot through the roof. He still gives me hell. I still give him hell, but I'm getting some insight into how the human animal operates and sometimes even some insight into what might have created in him the desire to go in this white nationalist direction. So it's actually been interesting sociological, anthropological research, but also just really interesting human connection.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I've talked about it before on the podcast and on the website. So a few years ago when I was living at rural Michigan, teaching at a local university, their small liberal arts college, I was at a bar. And I like to go out late at night to bars. One of my hobbies, like to do people watching. It's a jazz club. Music stopped. And there's this white guy sitting at the end of the bar. It's me, this brother who I think was Ethiopian or Somalian, was the bartender. And I'm reading some comic books. And the guy turns to the bartender, and I knew something was up with him just by his demeanor and his energy. Had to be about, early 20s. And he asked this really provocative question of the bartender, and I kid you not, true story. He says to the bartender, sir, and the gentleman looks over, he thinks he wants another drink, and he says, I have a question for you. And he said, if my grandfather owned your grandfather as a slave, what would you tell your grandfather to do?
Jesus.
Exactly. So I'm not one to back down. Maybe it's my own hard-headed working class nature from New Haven, Connecticut, and where I was raised. So I'm listening in because I'm nosy. And the guy's really shook by this character, and I haven't encountered these people before. So I said to the guy, why don't you ask me that question?
Yeah.
So he looks at me and he asked me the question. I said, I tell my grandfather to kill yours because slavery is a state of tyranny. So the guy's like, I never thought you'd say anything. I was like, why don't you come sit next to me? We'll have a few beers together. That was one of the most productive interactions I have ever had.
Yeah.
Understand that these people, they may be pathological racists, but they're real. Right. We know that. They believe these things and they're dangerous. Right. But if you can establish a connection, maybe you can try to undo a little of that logic. You may not be able to change them, but it will make your craft a little bit better. But speaking of craziness and people coming unhinged, I got to ask the obvious. Certainly in 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, or 8 years ago, rather, when Obama was elected, we knew some people would lose their natural minds, given the history of white supremacy in this country. What is your take on the white male rage that's manifesting itself, and this is my thesis and others, and I'm curious as to what you think about it, in sort of the interpersonal violence against black folks like Eric Garner and Michael Brown, and it's in George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, that case, and then sort of the macro level overt white supremacy from the Republicans waving Confederate flags and birtherism?
Well, I think, in my book, Dear White America, I obviously lay out this thesis that we're in this era of anxious whiteness, this white anxiety, white resentment era. And it's not, an original thesis. Obviously, a lot of people have offered up similar arguments. But in the book, my point was that this particular moment is a perfect storm for white anxiety. So you've got a black president, but not just a black president. You've got a black president with an exotic name, who has an exotic background, who grew up in Hawaii, which is, to most white people, a vacation destination. They're not even aware that it's a state, I think, sometimes. And he lived part of his life outside of the country, my goodness. And it's not just that he's a person of color. He has this very sort of quote unquote normal background. As Rush Limbaugh put it, the problem with Barack Obama is he doesn't have a typical American Midwestern story. I mean, that was something that Limbaugh said several years ago. So there's that. Then you add to that the economic meltdown that was underway when Obama became president, which was confronting white people for the first time in, let's be honest, 75 or 80 years, with a level of economic insecurity that we were not used to. White folks hadn't faced double-digit unemployment since the 30s. And so you've got the black president, you've got economic anxiety that you haven't dealt with in several generations. Then you've got a third factor, the popular culture, right, is thoroughly multicultural. And I think we underestimate the importance of that, because part of white supremacy has always been the ability to define the terms of the culture, so that when you turn on that television, the people who are the entertainers, the pop icons, they're going to look like you. For those of us that are old enough, we recall that, a quarter century ago, it seems like a long time, but 25 years is nothing. 25 years ago, MTV would not even play videos by black artists.
Yeah, Michael Jackson was too black for MTV.
Michael Jackson was the first one, and then they maybe showed a couple of Prince videos, but even then they were pretty sketchy about that. So 25 years ago, you didn't see, even though popular, music and art and entertainment and food and fashion has always been influenced by peoples of color, it was certainly not as visible in the popular imagination. So now you've got white parents whose kids, all over the country, the posters on their walls are black and brown folk. And for people that have grown up with a sense of cultural hegemony, I'm sure that's got to be pretty freaky. So you got the black president, you got the economic meltdown, you got the multicultural pop culture, which leads white folks to think, oh my God, we're losing control of the narrative. And then you've got the demographic shift, which we're all aware of, that within 30 years, half the country will be people of color. So now you've got all those things happening at once. If it was just one of them, or maybe two of them, I'm not sure that we would see the anger of the Tea Party, I want my country back nonsense. I'm not sure that we would see the sort of hyper-policing militarization that we're seeing in black and brown communities. But when you add all four of those, together, and you've got a group of people who for all of their lives have been able to say, this here, this country, this is ours. And now that other people are able to say, actually, no, it's all of ours, and we're going to make claim to it, you've got people that are freaking out. We got the torture report released today. Here you've got a country from the very highest levels of government that was authorizing the kinds of interrogation techniques that we would readily and rightly condemn any other country in the world for doing. But we did that in the name of what? In the name of safety. Safety against whom? The dreaded other, the dreaded religious other, the dreaded ethnic other, the dreaded national other. This is what a dying empire does, whether it's on a racial level or a national level. It lashes out. It's sort of like a death rattle. And I think it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous.
I mean, and you hit on something there, I'm sure a lot of folks, yourself, myself included, are going to be pointing this out. And I'm really waiting for Henry Garreau's comments on this, too. I was talking to him earlier on Twitter. You have a clear, direct causal arrow in line between Michael Brown's body laying in the street as an act of racial terrorism and this torture report, because it's all part of the culture of cruelty. I'm more concerned about the things that aren't in there, because if folks believe that's the real report, they're lying to themselves, given the history of how governments practice secrecy. But if you go and read accounts of lynchings in this country, what the torture report, that's Disney compared to what was done to black and brown bodies in this country.
You're in Chicago, right? Okay, so who is this cop that just got released from prison after 4 years? He was like a big high-ranking member of the Chicago PD that did maybe 4 years in prison, but for 2 decades he had engaged in the torture of black suspects.
Yep.
Right. I mean, so here's the thing. Like we're not even, forget Guantanamo for a minute. Forget Abu Ghraib. Let's think about the fact that in a major United States city, there was a high-ranking police officer who was not only did he engage in torture on a routine basis against suspected criminals, I think all of whom were black in his case, but he was protected in doing that. This goes to the issue of the culture of policing that we need to be talking about in this country in the wake of Ferguson, in the wake of Eric Garner in that case. Because that cop could not have gotten away with what he did in the city of Chicago had he not been protected by the police union, had he not been protected by his brothers in blue and occasionally, I suppose, some sisters in blue who all protected him. Torture of black and brown bodies is a normative experience. It has been a normative experience in this country, and it is only the only thing surprising about it is that we're surprised about it.
And how do you maintain your surprise or outrage meter? Because I had a really kind comment on the website, ChaunceyDeVega.com, where one of our recurring commenters said, Chauncey, I'm really disturbed by the fact that when this information comes out, you say you're never shocked or surprised, and we should never stop being shocked and surprised. And I appreciated the intervention. I actually wrote back to her. I was like, yeah, that's a great intervention, and I got to meditate on it. But you can easily become exhausted. So how do you balance, going back to one of my favorite movies, Training Day with Denzel Washington, the idea of balancing your smiles and your cries? Can we ever just become numb, or can we, on the other hand, become too sensitive?
Well, I think a person can become numb, but I think what keeps us from becoming numb is that we recognize that we have this capacity to be better. I mean, I really do believe that in spite of the history of white supremacy, the history of misogyny, the history of class inequity and oppression, all of the systems of oppression, I really do believe that we are capable of better. And so because of that, even though I'm never shocked to learn about the horrors that we as humans practice upon one another, I also keep in mind that I have to be shocked only because I'm going to try to compare those horrors to the ideal. And I know we're never necessarily going to attain the ideal, but I believe we are capable of doing a lot more, a lot better than we are right now. And so that allows me to be shocked in the sense that my conscience is shocked. There's a difference between having your moral conscience shocked and your expectations shocked. My expectations are not particularly high for this country, and they're not particularly high for white folks living under white supremacy. But as human beings, I believe that we're capable of better. And so I allow myself to be morally shocked, even if I'm not practically surprised.
So I was thinking, too, about, the idea of moral shock and some of the public opinion data that we've seen. Again, nothing new for folks like us who've researched these topics, but the huge divides between black and white folks about the permanence of white supremacy, about racial progress. And I saw one today, I don't know if it was recent or folks have just reached back to it, given the Eric Garner case, where the finding was that there's a huge divide between blacks and whites. The vast majority of African Americans say the police are racist. The vast majority of white folks say that the police treat African Americans fairly, and there's no systemic racism in terms of police treatment. And then you connect that to the jurors, and again, going back to Judith Butler's idea of white racial paranoiac thinking, where you can look at a video of a man being choked to death and come up with some bizarre excuse to say he basically killed himself. The AP had a horrible story that basically recounted that narrative, basically saying that Eric Garner killed himself. And this was run by the AP Wire. So when you hear our white brothers and sisters who are in such denial about police brutality, you can watch a video or hear the testimony in the Michael Brown case and come to the conclusion that no harm was done, that no crime was committed. Is it just whiteness hurting the ethics and morality and reasoning ability of some white folks? Is it just ignorance? Is it something else?
I think in part, there are some white folks for whom our fears and our resentments and our hostility to black and brown bodies is so concretized that even watching someone killed will not sort of prick our conscience. Now, I'm not going to say that's true for all white people, but I think there is this tendency because of internalized bias, whether it's subconscious or whether it's quite explicit, that looks at Eric Garner and sees him is this hulking, dangerous character, even though we watch him die in front of our eyes. And we can believe Darren Wilson's narrative about Mike Brown because we've been trained to believe that narrative. We don't know people, the vast majority of white folks don't know people like Michael Brown. We don't know, first of all, most white folks don't know a lot of people of color because 85% of white folks, according to the data, live in neighborhoods with very few people of color around. So A, we don't know very many folks of color. B, we certainly don't know a lot of folks of color from working class and lower income communities like that in Ferguson. And we don't know a lot of 6'4", 300-pound black guys. So all of a sudden it's like you hear all of that, and that is the walking embodiment of white anxiety. That is the breathing embodiment of white fear. And that's no excuse for white fear, but it is to say that when white folks hear a story about that, it's going to be a lot easier for us to go to that place where we've been conditioned to go because we don't have enough experience in our own life with people that rebut that narrative. If you know 6'4", 300-pound black dudes and you actually are in a community where there are plenty of black folks walking around all the time who, then you have a counter to the stereotype. But if you don't have that, all you do is soak up the images that come from mass media, the images that come from political campaigns, the images, whatever it is. And so it's not ignorance in the pure definitional sense. It's more of a cultivated ignorance and an internalized bias that I think white folks in particular need to confront because it's doing a very serious number on our humanity and our ability to see pain in black and brown bodies.
I mean, that always brings me back to, honorable brother, activist, historian Noel Ignatieff. Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. But I mean, you're spot on there. I mean, there's one of the central paradoxes of late 20th and 21st century America and the world is that black folk, and to a lesser degree, people of color in general, but in particular African Americans, are hyper visible in the mass media. But those images of African Americans, very often, especially men, are tinted through a lens of black hyper thug masculinity. And then you compound that with segregated social networks, where, as you pointed out, I think it was Pew who did the research, or was a general social survey that comes out so often that said the vast majority of white folks don't even know anybody who's not white. And then you have this deep history in our country where you have this deep fascination with the black body, everything from, physicality to sexuality to athleticism, and this deep revulsion and loathing of the black body. But how do we explain something, a horrible case like Tamir Rice, where you can have well-meaning, well-meaning white folks who are good to their grandparents, take care of dogs, help the homeless, they go to church or synagogue every weekend, and they can look at that case with a 12-year-old kid gunned down by an incompetent cop who's a member of a documented racist department and still see threat? Is it just adultification plus infantilization in terms of the white gaze and black bodies?
Well, it definitely is adultification, as all that new research has found. White folks tend to see black folks as older than they are and more threatening than they are. And so they can look at a 12-year-old and they can see threat. They can look at Trayvon Martin at 17. They can see threat. They can, there's nothing new about that. I hope that when people, I don't know what the numbers are of how many white folks percentage-wise have actually looked at the Tamir Rice video. I would hope, and maybe I'm being naive, I would hope that if folks looked at it and compared what they can see with the narrative that was spun by the cops before they knew there was a video, where they obviously have lied about telling him to drop his weapon 3 times, which they clearly had no time to do. I would hope that most white folks of conscience will look at that and go, oh my God, this is just straight up murder. But having, watched the video of John Crawford getting dropped in the Walmart outside of Akron, also in Ohio, obviously, I can't necessarily assume that because a lot of white folks rationalize that one. So I don't know for sure. I think that the years of propaganda and the years of training and conditioning to be afraid of black males in particular, and yet, as you say, to also sort of revere them. I mean, we have this weird, it's a very interesting dichotomy where, white folks will very readily, for instance, cheer, and I mentioned this in a piece that I wrote the other day, will cheer black ball players who go and play gladiator, essentially, for 2 hours to make money for the hometown team. But God forbid they raise their hands in solidarity with the community of Ferguson and with Mike Brown's family, because all of a sudden now they've stepped out of their accepted role. And it'll be really interesting to see in Cleveland. I mean, here you have LeBron James, put on a I Can't Breathe shirt last night before the game, and a couple other players on the Cavaliers have done that, and players on other teams have done that. It'll be really interesting to see what LeBron and the rest of the Cavs do if the cop who killed Tamir Rice is not indicted. I just want, just imagine for a minute what an impact it would make if that cop, and let's hope he is indicted, obviously, but if he isn't, what kind of impact would it make if the Cavaliers said, or at least if LeBron said, I ain't playing until this guy is indicted for something. I'm not playing. Now, I don't know that he is going to do that, and I can't tell him to do that. It's certainly not his job to take the weight of the world on his shoulders, but just imagine what an impact it would make. Now, two things I think would happen. Number one, it would get a lot of attention. If all of a sudden you have this star ball player, the best player possibly in the league right now, one of the best of all time, saying, I'm not going to play because my hometown police force in this community, not where he's from, but he's from Ohio, but the place where he plays now, they are not going to be held accountable, so I'm not going to play and make money for them. I'm not going to let them cheer me. That would be huge. And I think, of course, the unfortunate reality, I'm afraid that I know, is that a lot of white Cavaliers fans would now hate him. They would rip up their posters. They would tear up the jerseys with his name on it because they want LeBron James to basically bojangle for them, right, every night on the court. And to his credit, he is saying, I'm not doing that. I'm putting on this shirt, and I don't care what you think about it. And those Rams players said, I don't care what you think about it. This is what I need to do. John Carlos and Tommy Smith in 1968 in Mexico City said, we're raising our fist, and we don't care what you think. And they were vilified for that. They were criticized, they were condemned, and it affected the trajectory of their life. Muhammad Ali was hated for years by white boxing fans who would cheer against him no matter who he was boxing, just because they didn't like his stance on Vietnam, and they didn't like the fact that he was in the Nation of Islam. Nowadays, Muhammad Ali, is like a secular saint almost, I think, to sports fans. But it took a long time to get to that place because white folks had decided, we like you entertaining us. We don't like you reminding us of the country in which we live. And so it's going to be interesting to see in coming weeks sort of what happens as these athletes continue to take a stance, because we do have this fascination with the black male body as athlete and as entertainer. But like you said, this revulsion, not just about fear and anxiety, but about just black men asserting themselves, and black women for that matter, asserting themselves as independent thinking human beings.
We see that, too, with a lot of the discourse, around Obama, bringing it back to that about he's uppity. He's a tyrant. He's disrespectful. It's part of that same racial imagination. And the sports angle it would be really fascinating because it really would come down to how dare LeBron James and these black athletes interfere in our pleasure as white spectators. This is our space, and you work for us, and you are here to entertain. And I'll bet money. I'm sure someone has done the research. Go online. I'm sure someone will search JSTOR or some other database. I bet there is a pretty high overlap in terms of the Venn diagram between obsessive sports radio fans and right-wing hate talk fans.
Oh, I have no doubt.
I mean, they're 99% of the same people, and it's the same sort of rhetoric and the same structure to the conversations. So LeBron would catch hell, quite literally, and get death threats. So it would be really something to see what he does. I know you're pressed for time. Tell us about your documentary, because number one, it's a really good documentary, and I don't give credit where credit isn't due, so it's excellent work. MEF put it out, and they have a wonderful history in terms of putting out great work on race, on popular culture. So what was that process like?
It was weird. I don't like watching myself on film. I just don't. I don't know. I've got heavy eyelids, so I look at my eyelids. I'm like, I look like a turtle, and I've always found that interesting. I don't know why I have those heavy eyelids, but I guess it's a genetic thing, so I've learned to embrace it. But I just hate watching myself on video anyway, and especially when it's huge and, your face is blown up a million times. But I have watched the documentary a couple of times in front of larger audiences. We've actually screened it at a couple schools, and I've watched it with the audience. And it's really great because you can really sense when the audience is getting getting what you're saying and how they're vibing with it and how they're responding. And it's so much more powerful than a lecture. I mean, I like giving a talk, and I generally can be pretty entertaining and humorous and keep an audience's attention, but there's nothing like moving pictures, video with lots of mixed media to keep people's attention. So of course, now I look at the documentary and I appreciate that you found it to be so strong. I love the folks at Media Education Foundation. They do amazing work, and it was a real pleasure to work with them. I, of course, now can look at that hour and 8-minute documentary and I can see all kinds of problems with it that I wish, we go back and fix. And that's true, I'm sure, for everybody's ever made a movie. There are things I wish we had done. I wish we had done some stuff about immigration and backlash to immigration and white privilege in that regard. And there are just a lot of issues I feel we didn't cover, but I know we had limited time. But I do think that it definitely demonstrates the value of multiple approaches. Some people can be reached by a book. Some people can be reached by a blog. Some people are reached by tweets. Other people are going to be reached by YouTube videos or by documentaries, or they're going to be reached by slam poetry. They're going to be reached by hip hop, or they're going to be reached by whatever. So I think we just want to try all the different tools. And for me, doing the documentary was just a new tool for me, but it's one that I know has been, for some folks has been really effective.
And what are you working on now? I mean, what's in your immediate future? So you got the documentary. What's the next book about?
Well, the book that'll be out, I'm hoping by early February. It's my own fault that it's so late because I was late getting it done. But so I have a book called The Culture of Cruelty, and the subtitle of that is How America's Elite Demonize the Poor, Valorize the Rich, and Jeopardize the Future. So it's really an exploration of inequality and the way we rationalize inequality in this country by, bashing folks at the bottom, praising folks at the top, and holding on to this myth of meritocracy against all evidence to the contrary, that it's just not true. And I'm looking at that. So I'm looking at class, obviously, but I'm trying to ask, why is it that we are so much more hostile, it seems, today toward the poor, the unemployed, those who are struggling, than we were 70 and 80 years ago during the Depression? And of course, the answer to that has a lot to do with race, because of the racialization of poverty, the racialization of need, the racialization of the social welfare state. The idea 75, 80 years ago, white folks loved big government because it was white folks who felt they were the only ones getting benefits, and they were. And as soon as people of color gained access to that stuff, that's when all of a sudden, we discovered our inner libertarian and decided, oh, no, we hate big government. So race has a lot to do with it, as does the larger myth of meritocracy, as does popular culture. I mean, one of the arguments I make is that we have a popular culture that really feeds these notions of rags to riches, reality TV shows where incredibly mediocre people can become famous and influential and quite wealthy. And that just sort of feeds the idea that, hey, if you're not making it, what's wrong with you? Honey Boo Boo's got a show, or she did, she doesn't now. The hillbilly hand fishing guys, they've got a gimmick. Duck Dynasty, the Storage Wars guys, the pawn shop guy, they've all got shows. So if they can make it and they can be big and successful, then what the hell's wrong with you that you can't make more than $20,000 a year, right? So I feel like there's a lot of stuff happening in our culture that feeds this sort of my original title for the book was actually Resurrecting Scrooge, and my editor didn't like that title. I loved it, but he didn't like it. But actually I have a chapter in the book called Resurrecting Scrooge, because in a lot of ways, and I actually quote Dickens directly from Christmas Carol, that whole segment when the two guys come into Scrooge's office and they ask him for charity donations. And if you recall, his answer is something along the lines of, what, are there no more workhouses, no more prisons? He's basically saying, why can't we just take all the poor and send them to a workhouse, which is what they did, obviously, in England in those days. And in some ways, I feel like we're resurrecting Scroogeism. When Dickens wrote that character, he was very clear. Scrooge was the asshole. Like that was the part of the plot. Like Scrooge was not the Dickensian hero. He was not the misunderstood figure. He was the asshole. And I feel like nowadays, if Scrooge lived in the United States, he would have a talk radio show and a spot on Fox, right? Because we've resurrected that as an acceptable philosophical discourse. And so the book is trying to chip away at that, really trying to bridge the gap between class and race analysis and move the conversation forward. It should be out in February, I would say March at the absolute latest.
And what publisher?
That's City Lights, the same folks that have done my last 3 books.
Thinking about the Scrooge analogy, that would have been a great title, because the other irony there is if Scrooge was alive today, he'd be in charge of some prosperity gospel ministry. in the deep South, and he'd be making money hand over foot, preaching against the poor, because, as I'm sure you point out in the book, we have this convergence of free market fundamentalism, otherwise known as neoliberalism, religious fundamentalism, the cultural cruelty, white supremacy, all coming together in this moment. And the point about reality TV is so frightening, because when I talk to students in my classes about reality TV, in my cultural studies classes, I am stupefied by how so many of them believe that it's real. So you have people who believe the lie, believe this illusion, because the real world is just too damn scary. So they latch on to a fake reality and live vicariously through these characters.
Right. Absolutely. No, it's incredibly dangerous. And I think that now there are, having said that, there are some interesting reality shows that actually do push back against that elitist narrative a little bit. I mean, actually, it doesn't get enough attention, but like Undercover Boss, right, is a really interesting show, because here you have a show where the boss, like the executives in these companies, go out and they just pretend to be, just average everyday workers in the company that they actually run. They don't let anybody know who they are, and they discover how hard it is and how the real work is getting done by average, everyday working class people who are horribly underpaid. I'm not sure that it leads them to change their compensation structures, but I do know that it's an interesting narrative. It's actually a narrative that pushes back and shows us that it isn't the CEO who, the CEO does not earn or does not deserve 300 times the pay of the average worker. And these CEOs who do that show, they recognize at the end of the day that they wouldn't be where they are if it weren't for their workers. And to me, that's a really counter-hegemonic narrative, but most of the reality shows are not like that at all. Most of them are about, essentially reinforcing the rags to riches kind of mythology that's always been at the heart of this country's narrative.
Tim Wise, telling the truth. So fresh from CNN, I appreciate you taking the time to sit down here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, the podcast for We Are Respectable Negroes. Where can folks find you online, Twitter and elsewhere, if they want to reach out to you?
Well, the website is www.timwise.org. There's an email button on there for folks that want to write me directly. The Twitter feed is @TimJacobWise. There's also a Facebook page. They used to call it a fan page. That's a little obnoxious. It's just a official Tim Wise page. You can go and it's on the timwise.org, actually, over on the right-hand side. So folks can connect with me there, or Twitter @TimJacobWise, or on the website.
And Tim, I just want to thank you one more time. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Wow, that was really good. I want to thank Tim one more time for being so cool and generous with his time. He flies halfway across the country, goes on television, and then he and I talk for another hour. Isn't it neat how small the world has become? Yeah, I'm a Luddite, and maybe I'm just impressed by simple technology, quote unquote, but that you can watch somebody live on the television, then talk to him, and be like, well, I just saw you. That's just amazing to me. And I say to myself, if we had a zombie apocalypse or an EMP pulse go off or some other disaster that necessitated hitting the reset button and starting all over, maybe I've been reading World War Z too much. I don't know what useful skills I have. I think me and a lot of other folk would be proof of Durkheim's distinctions about the difference between organic and mechanical or mechanistic societies, as he terms it. So that's neither here nor there. Sociology joke. We'll throw in some Weber in there too. Am I the only one too? Being an academic geek for a moment who confuses Weber and Weber. I see the Weber grill and I want to call it the Weber grill. And then I want to go there and eat some of their mediocre steak that smells so good when you're walking by, but when you get in there, you're just like, this ain't very good. So thanks to Tim. And as I said, I wanted to do something a little different. The format for the podcast is two folk hanging out at the virtual bar who chat, and the conversation goes where it goes. I really don't have a lot of notes. I don't have things up in front of me saying, ask this, and this. And there's a place for that. I'm sure for a lot of folk that works. But when you've read somebody's work, when you followed them for a few years, and you're walking that racism beat, albeit he's much more high profile, a role model in many ways than I am. We're still fellow travelers on that road. There's so many things you're just curious about. I mean, this is a business in a lot of ways. This is nuts and bolts. And some may think that there's a huge hustle here and that folks are getting rich off of doing some truth telling, but they're really not. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And just thinking about it, you're on the plane, you're going to universities, you're talking. And I was thinking too, and I alluded to it in my question about how many emails he gets and does he read comments, that what it must be like to have folks who want you to lay hands and heal. Have you ever been in those conversations, either with folks who are putting time in their local communities, academics who study a given topic, people who are engaged in anti-racism, anti-homophobia, anti-sexism, anti-poverty programs, that there are folk out there who want you to lay hands on me, and heal and provide knowledge and information as I cut off the top of my head and you pour water in my brain, like knowledge. It don't work that way. I mean, it's an iterative process, and we're all in this together. But that is a sacred responsibility, and it's one that Tim Wise takes very seriously, which is why I really respect his craft, his presentation, his style, and his substance. And there's so much going on. I actually didn't get a chance to ask him about this, but he'll be on the show again, I'm sure, about thinking about the balance in terms of writing style. Because if you know the literature that Tim is drawing on in his books, there's a lot going on underneath the hood of that car. That engine is tuned up, but he gets the folk in the car to drive it. And I don't know if they always realize the mechanics involved. If they don't realize how fine-tuned that engine is. I always want to know if he'd write a straight academic book with a ton of footnotes to really show off his craft in that regard, because he has a great public voice and a lot of expertise. But I just like to see him do a, transparent, here we go, I'm showing you my chops sort of work that would be a little less accessible, but would certainly, I think, be very, 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 very valuable. And never mind the fact that he and I talked about the documentary, which is a whole other conversation about that whole process. I wish we had a little more time to chop that up, about how do you get the funding for it, who approaches who, how you decide what stays in and stays out, what ends up on the cutting room floor, do you storyboard it? Do you get the talking heads? I mean, I'm just very fascinated, and friends of the Chauncey DeVega show know I'm very fascinated by process, how folks go about doing what they do. So I hope you learned something from Tim Wise, and I think he gave some good teaching there for anybody who's interested in how the media works, how you go and prepare yourself for interviews on radio or TV. I know we have a wide-ranging audience in terms of the folks who follow the website, so I'm sure that will be of use to some folks, and of course, of great use to me. That's one of the things I love about the podcast series, is I try to ask substantive questions, have interesting conversation, but I want to learn some stuff too that's pertinent to me, with the trust that it's going to be something of interest to the listeners too. So that was just, like I said, a lot of wisdom, a lot of truth telling. So back to the holiday season. I'll call it the holiday season. There is no war on Christmas. We know that. That's a made up myth of the right-wing media. Maybe we need, as Salon had an interesting piece today, to have a war on the lies in anti-intellectualism. That is the myth of Christmas. And I'm sure folks who know the history will know this is a pagan holiday. Santa Claus did not exist. If there was a real Santa, telling the people at Fox, he would be a brown Turk. I think that's actually where that mythology is drawn from. American Santa is from Coca-Cola. Never mind Sinterklaas. Sinterklaas is cool. He goes and he takes his little black slaves. There's a tradition in the Netherlands. They put on blackface because they're dirty and Santa's been beating them, all the little bad kids. And they run around and parade. And every year have all this controversy from folks in other countries who don't understand or tolerate the allusion to blackface. And our friends in the Netherlands are like, no. It's just Sinterklaas. Try to enjoy the holiday season for what it is. Try to do a little good in your part of the world. Give a hug to somebody who looks like they need it. Don't be a pervert now going up to strangers giving them hugs. Don't say that Chauncey DeVega said, you on the train, that it's okay to hug strangers. That's not what I said. I said go and show a little love and kindness. It's late in the holiday season in terms of Christmas, but if you can go. Toys for Tots is still collecting toys. And I was thinking about my own childhood. I was a royal pain in the butt. Spoiled beyond belief. Had every toy I ever wanted. And as kids are prone to do, would complain when I didn't get the one thing that I really wanted. And I would want to thank my parents for that. I was walking around the store the other day, Target, or maybe it was Marshall's, looking for my cheap made-in-China irregular pants or sweaters or Burlington Coat Factory. And it dawned on me that as a kid, I always got my toys from Toys R Us, from Chow World, from Macy's. They didn't have great toys, but they had really cool electronics back in the day. That's where you can get some really good Nintendos. Or we could go down to New York and go to some of the really fancy toy stores, FAO Schwartz back in the day. And I always got what I wanted. And maybe that's the innocence of youth. You get all sorts of stuff if you're lucky and you don't appreciate it because you always think that's just the way that the world is. And the innocence of youth perhaps for some, because there are a whole lot of kids out here who are victims of adultification, who have had to grow up a lot sooner than they should have. And that's the unfair side of the world. But if you were blessed like I was and a lot of my friends, we had this cocoon of innocence around us, even though we had hard things to deal with. Looking back, things were a lot more perilous at times than I realized in my home. But I just want to thank my parents for always making sure this ghetto nerd had a wonderful Christmas, even if it meant they didn't get a lot for themselves. So that's why I just promised myself, as life turns around, fingers crossed, to give that payback to moms and send that positive energy to my dad. Be like, thank you. So that's just me dropping the mask for a moment, dropping the veil. But please, this holiday season, be good to each other, be good to your families. Do something nice for yourself if you can. Do something nice for a stranger. Recharge your batteries. It's been a rough year. A lot of folks. And send some positive energy out to the families of these folks who've been killed by the police, these innocent black and brown folk and poor white folk and First Nations brothers and sisters, a whole story there, who've been shot down in the street. And just try, like I said, to be good to each other. So after the New Year, so this is our Christmas episode of the Chauncey DeVega Show. For New Year's, probably not going to do an episode, but you never know, maybe a surprise. We shall see, but we'll formally begin after the New Year. And I got so many great folks I've talked to. As of now, got about 36 shows, either recorded or promised and scheduled. And the surprises and the good smart folk are just going to keep on coming. So I want to take this time again to thank everybody who's been on season 3 of the podcast so far. So from memory, my dear friend Bill the Lizard, we started doing our Star Wars episode. I want to thank Pastor Renita Lampkin, Lou Du Bois, talking about Ferguson, Nick Childs, the one and only, talking about his new book about how to deal with the police, how to survive the new Jim and Jane Crow as an African American, as a person of color, how to navigate encounters with the cops and the courts. Great conversation, as I said 2 podcasts ago. He was just on C-SPAN, so check him out. He and his co-author. Great conversation. And our last guest, Jason Calavito, talking about ancient aliens, extraterrestrials, white supremacists, giants that roam the earth, the Nephilim, and all that great stuff. That was a really fun conversation. If you haven't gone to Jason Calavito's website, do check it out. And once more and again, you've got ChaunceyDeVega.com, you've got the YouTube channel, you've got the podcast, and I want to thank all of you for making that happen and giving me that positive energy. And one more big thank you to all the folks who have donated to, supported, and show love to the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show and my work online more generally. So, our first 2 guests, we're going to do a little musically oriented conversation to bring in the year 2015. I never would have thought I would see the year 2015. My God, where does time go? It's like the future is the present and now the past. So, 2 cool folks to change the vibe a little bit as we start the year. We're going to talk about music. The first guest is going to be the pop culture editor for Slate.com. He's also an assistant professor of American Studies, and he and I are going to talk about his recent essay about anniversaries in hip-hop. We got all these albums that just turned 20 years old. Again, showing us how old we are, where the albums are older than some of our students in my case. That we're going to talk about Biggie, my favorite MC of all time, and we can make our obligatory Chris Rock top 5 list joke, greatest MCs of all time. But he and I spent about an hour talking with Notorious B.I.G. about commercial hip-hop, about teaching hip-hop in the classroom, across the color line, the idea that pop music now belongs to all people, and these anxieties that many folks have of the post-civil rights, post-racial, in quotation marks, generation, to even name black music as black music. And we have a really, and this anxiety that so many of our young folks have and others about naming a thing, that black music is a real thing. We can talk about how do we define black music, how ethnomusicologists define black music, how cultural studies and sociology types define black music, how anthropologists describe black music. So whenever that comes up in my classes, I'm always taken aback by how there's this anxiety by African American and Afro-Caribbean students to say there's such a thing as black music. That really does tell us a lot about historical denial and also the way that racial discourse has been inverted and twisted in this country. So that's going to be the first talk. Second talk is going to be the following week. Conversation with Mickey Hess, wrote a great new book about Old Dirty Bastard. That was my nickname in college. I was Old Dirty Bastard because baby, when Shimmy Shimmy came on, watch out. I won't even tell you my stories about Buju Banton and Shabba Ranks. And I'm so tempted to say Shabba, but here's a great what if. Old Dirty, as far as I know, never did a Christmas song. Now that's one of those great what ifs in history. We would have Run DMC's Christmas song next to Old Dirty. Man, sure a lot of folks are listening to Mariah Carey as they go about their shopping. That's another great what if. What the heck happened to Mariah Carey? Was it just Nick Cannon or did other things bring her down? But boy, can she sing. So, till next year, be safe again, be happy, be wise, and may 2015 be better than 2014 for all of you and myself. And if 2014 was great for you, may 2015 be a continuance of all that wonderful greatness. Till 2 weeks from now, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays from Chauncey DeVega and the Chauncey DeVega Show.